Hey, what's going on, everybody? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're watching this from. Thank you for joining the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. We have over 36 hours of continuous sessions with over 300 speakers, 7 languages, and 400 sessions, including sessions from Jeff Teeper, Caruana, and John Leviscu. I'm excited to be here with you today to present my session on Teams in Real Life. We have a lot to cover in this session, so I'm going to dive right in. And at the end of our time, I'll answer any questions you may have. If we don't answer them then, feel free to email or get a hold of me on Twitter. Let's take a moment and recognize those who had a hand in making this event happen. We all have had an interesting last few months, so being able to do something like this for the community, not just in the US, but across the world, is amazing. So let's give a big shout out to the SPC team, Joel, Ryan, Galen, and the entire crew behind the scenes making this such a success. And of course, our sponsors. Without them, none of this would be possible. Diamond sponsors, Perficient and CoreView. Gold sponsor, AppPoint. Silver sponsors, Affirma, QuizCom, Valo, PointFire, and Swoop. I'm happy to be a part of Perficient. We're a leading digital transformation consulting firm that's been in business since 1998. We have offices across the US with a wide range of expertise, spanning from enterprise mobile applications, creative services, marketing, digital strategy, information technology, custom dev, and platform implementations. If you're interested in any of the things that I've mentioned, feel free to reach out. My name is Chris Barber. I'm a solutions architect at Perficient, so I might be a little biased on the sponsors. I'm based out of the Southern California area, and I've worked primarily in healthcare organizations over the last 11 years. I've done a lot of everything from account management to FIM to iOS development to EHR implementations, Allscripts, Epic, Meditech, Windows servers, VMware, JD Edwards, you name it. I also volunteer and speak in the California community for SPS events. But like many of you in the audience, I started this journey with SharePoint. One of our server admins needed a hand with some HTML and knew me, so he reached out, and after that, it was game over. I went from SharePoint to terrible looking InfoPath forms like everybody else, automating them into libraries, to SharePoint Designer, and everything in between. Good times. Fast forwarding to today, my recent focuses have been primarily on the Graph API, Power Platform, and Teams as the center of the hub for your workplace. Transitioning the thought process from Teams as a Skype replacement to Teams as its own platform with conversations, files, custom connections, automation, and now bots. Enough about me though. I'm not a huge fan of that. If you want to get a hold of me and bounce an idea or maybe ask a question, feel free. You can get a hold of me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or obviously my email. Of course, I'll be sharing my deck at the end via social media or LinkedIn if you'd like to take a look. Before we get started though, I just want to take a second and say thank you all for attending, and I hope you pick up at least one thing from my session today. Microsoft Teams is a hot topic in today's world, with the combination of work from home, the impending sunset of Skype for Business, or current COVID-19's pandemic. Teams consumption is drastically rising. For businesses that have either just dipped their toes into the Teams platform previously or hadn't used it at all, this requires learning how to deploy the platform quickly. A lot of times when we roll out a new Microsoft product or a product in general, we open the floodgates, which then causes a knee-jerk reaction down the road to completely pull back and restrict everything. On top of that, as I'm sure you're all aware, Teams usage has surpassed over 44 million daily active users as a result of the pandemic. In a couple months, we'll see that a number of organizations will need to go back and reconfigure the way Teams was deployed in order to respond to the global pandemic. Due to the rapid response efforts, the deployment policies and governance controls were not enforced. To avoid that, today I want to show you how to create a repeatable process for the generation of Teams using the Graph API, Power Automate, and a custom connector. So what if we could template these things out so rollouts were able to happen as quickly as businesses needed them to, What if these templates could replicate permissions or restrictions while ensuring continuity, consistency, and security in a repeatable process? And what if we could avoid the knee-jerk reaction, upset users, and reduce shadow IT? In our session today, we're going to talk about using Teams templates, a SharePoint list, the Graph API with an Azure App Registration, and the Power Platform to build a self-service Microsoft Teams provisioning process. I might even sneak in a few demos for other Graph API Teams-related actions, depending on how we do with time. With the Graph API Clone a Team action, we have the ability to mix and match the pieces to get the desired outcome we want based on a template or multiple templates. We can determine if you want to include everything but the members, all the members but maybe not the channels, all the members but modify the permissions to match a specific group's needs. All of this can be done via an automated process that takes only a couple of minutes to complete. So let's imagine that we're all in this magical world where things don't go wrong, projects are planned, IT departments can actually prepare for projects, and unicorns roam freely. We know this stuff typically doesn't happen. So how do we avoid this? We avoid it by building these templates in Microsoft Teams. We avoid this by planning. We avoid this by being consistent and having processes in place. The way that this breaks down and the solution that I've built is we have a single app registration with a custom connector that uses the Graph API to call the Teams clone process. We have a Power Automate that runs everything and handles the automation of the tasks. This is going to be the process that connects to the SharePoint list upon submission. It'll handle the approvals, the notifications, and carry out any of the tasks that we need. So let's get started. Let's go ahead and dive into our first section, the Microsoft Graph API. What is the Graph API? How does the Graph API relate to Microsoft Teams and what we're talking about today? And lastly, what's the Graph Explorer? What does it do and how do I access it? Everyone is connecting to the Microsoft stack via their own tool sets, but one of the best tools released by Microsoft in the last few years is the Graph API. The Graph's secret weapon is its ability to connect or automate tasks in almost any system utilizing a single endpoint, providing us all access to rich, people-centric data and insights to Microsoft 365 services. You can use REST APIs or SDKs to access the endpoint and build apps to support scenarios spanning across productivity, collaboration, education, security, identity, access, and device management. Essentially, it's a developer's API platform to connect, interact, and develop upon. With the seamless integration to Azure, Power Automate, Windows, Security, Office, and CDS, the possibilities are almost endless. The Graph API has a number of actions associated with the Microsoft Teams platform, whether that's cloning a team, creating channels, adding members, including owners on a team, and the list goes on from there. For the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to cover the Clone a Team Graph API action. This operation allows you to copy a base template or an existing group while selecting the pieces you'd like to bring over. These options include apps, channels, members, the settings of a team, and of course tabs. The only permission required is the Graph API's group read-write all, which we will get into when we build our Azure App Registration later on in this session. So how do I get started with the Graph APIs? Well, lucky for us, Microsoft built something for this exact purpose. The Graph Explorer is a web-based tool that you can utilize to build and test requests using Microsoft Graph APIs. You can access this by navigating to developer.microsoft.com as shown on the screen. It has a ton of pre-built samples to get you started, whether that's getting user profile information, retrieving email or event properties, or maybe items that are trending in your organization. Within the Graph Explorer, you can also search for additional pre-built and available samples to test before going out on your own. This has been a great tool for me when I'm not quite sure of the results I'm going to return, determining how I'm going to parse the JSON values, or maybe just look around at the possibilities of what we can build. The next piece to the puzzle that we're building today is Azure App Registrations. What is an Azure App Registration? How does the registration relate to Microsoft Teams and what we're doing here today? And then we're going to dive into building an app registration that we're going to use later on when we do our demo. An application registration through Azure allows developers and service providers the ability to integrate with the Microsoft Identity Platform, and by doing so, provides a secure sign-in and authorization for such services, whether it's in a single domain or multiple. For the purposes of our demo today, we will use an Azure App Registration in conjunction with the Graph API and Power Platform in order for the custom connector we're building to run utilizing OAuth Azure Active Directory security and allow the actions to complete successfully. So let's dive in and build our app registration in Azure, adding the necessary group read-write-all permissions that we mentioned in the previous section, which will enable us to utilize the clone a team action later on in our Power Automate flow. Our first step is going to be opening a browser window and navigating to Azure Active Directory via portal.azure.com. We're going to choose the Active Directory link in the left navigation menu. And then choose App Registrations in the Manage section of the Azure Active Directory blade. With that open, we'll go ahead and select choose the new registration menu at the top item of the app registration blade. With the app registration now open, we're going to enter our name for it, Marathon Graph API. In the supported account type section, select accounts in my organization. And for the time being, we're going to leave the redirect URI section blank. We'll come back to this later on once our connector has been built. With all of the fields now complete, we're going to go ahead and select register. Now that the base of our app registration has been created, let's take a minute to copy down some vital information we'll need later on for our custom connector. So at the top of the screen, let's copy the application ID's value, as well as the tenant ID value. Next, we're going to select the API permissions entry in the Manage section on the left-hand side. Once that page loads, we're going to navigate to the top of the page and select Add a Permission. Once the Request API Permissions panel has opened, we're going to select the Microsoft Graph. And for the purposes of today, once that's selected, we're going to choose Delegated Permissions. With Delegated Permissions now selected, we're going to scroll down just a little in that panel, and in the search box, type Group. This will return a number of options, but the only selection that we want is Group Read-Write-All. So we're going to check the box for that, and once completed, navigate to the bottom of the page and click the Add Permissions box. Now, depending on the access levels you have within your organizations, you might need to reach out to an administrator to grant consent. Luckily for us, I'm an admin in this tenant, so we'll grant consent and continue with our session. With our app registration now created and the permissions being granted, the only remaining step is to create a shared secret or provide a certificate. To do so, we're going to select the Certificates and Secrets entry in the Manage section of the Actions panel. This is going to prompt you with two different options, and based on your organization's policy, you'll need to move forward accordingly by either using a certificate provided by your organization or create a shared secret. I'll use a client secret for this app registration. To do so, I will click the New Client Secret button below, which will prompt me for two pieces of information: a description or naming for the secret, and the second, the lifespan of the client secret. Our options are 1 year, 2 years, or indefinite. Again, based on your organization's policy, this may vary, but I'm going to utilize the Never Expires option and then select the Add button to complete the process. One important piece of information I'll share with you is once you click the Add button, the shared secret will appear on screen. Be sure to copy down the key value, whether that's in Notepad, a screenshot, or a password vault. This is crucial for two reasons. The first is that we need this value for the custom connector during its setup, and the second is that you'll never see this value displayed again. So at this point, we've reviewed the Graph API, discussed the Clone a Team action used in our custom connector, built our Azure App Registration, and configured the necessary permissions, as well as created a shared secret for it. Now it's time to put the puzzle together by connecting the Graph API and Azure App Registration to our custom connector within the Power Platform. Power Platform and Connectors. In this section, we'll briefly discuss the Power Platform and connectors. If you aren't already familiar with it, the Power Platform encompasses Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, and the newest addition, Power Virtual Agents. Power BI is a powerful analytics tool that helps analyze and share data-based insights to your team. Power Apps is a suite of apps, services, connectors, and data platform that provides an application development environment to build custom apps for your business needs. Power Automate is a service that helps you create automated workflows between your favorite apps and services to synchronize files, get notifications, collect data, and build processes around. And the newest addition, Power Virtual Agents, empowers teams to easily create bots using a guided, no-code UI without the need for data scientists or developers. So what are connectors? What types of connectors are there? How do connectors relate to Microsoft Teams and what we're doing here today? What's the difference between a standard and custom connector? And when would you use each of these? So like we're seeing here on the screen, a connector is a proxy or a wrapper around an API that allows the underlying service to talk to Microsoft Power Automate, Power Apps, and Azure Logic Apps. It provides a way for users to connect their accounts and leverage a set of pre-built actions and triggers to build their apps and workflows. Now, out of the box, Microsoft offers over 320 connectors to connect to Microsoft and non-Microsoft services. Since January, when I originally presented this topic at Office 365 Saturday in San Diego, this number has almost increased by 100. So what's the difference between standard connectors and custom connectors? Standard connectors are a set of pre-built connections to applications and services and are available to everyone across the Microsoft licensing plans, while custom connectors are developed in-house by your organization to meet a specific need. Standard connectors can work for up to 75% of the time, but that other 25% of the time, like we're talking about here, you might want to do something where there's not an available connector for use. Custom connectors address this scenario by allowing you to create and even share a connector with its own triggers and actions. At this time, there are a number of Teams actions right now available in preview within Power Automate, like get a team, list teams, get channels, get messages, and list channels, but none of those directly meet our needs now. So in our scenario, we want to use an available Graph API action to clone an existing team and create a repeatable process that we can automate upon submissions by our end users. Now that we have discussed what the Power Platform is, what connectors are, and the difference between standard and custom connectors, let's delve a little deeper into why we would use a custom connector. Well, like we discussed in the previous slide, not all systems have available connectors, and not all systems have an easy way of integrating. But most enterprise-grade systems do have available APIs to them, and that is where custom connectors thrive. Microsoft has done a fantastic job about expanding the options, but sometimes what you need just isn't what everybody else needs. The second reason is if you're using the out-of-the-box HTTP connector, you might become frustrated by the additional work required to complete authentication like I did. When using the HTTP connector, you require additional steps to request the token, retrieve the token, and then pass that along so you can complete the requested action. With the custom connector, we bypass any of these additional token steps required in the HTTP connector in the workflow, allowing us to focus our attention on the workflow itself. Another important callout is that depending on the connector used, there could be fees or monthly plans associated with them from the vendor. So you want to calculate the cost variance between a custom connector and premium connectors to ensure that you have determined the best fit for your organization. The last reason, and probably one of the more important for me personally, is if things go well with the connector you built and the organization sees the benefit, you can control its future expansion. By including additional features, services, and tasks, which would only be natural, providing you and your organization the control you desire moving forward. Building a connector. In this portion of the session, we're going to put all the knowledge we have gained so far to build the connector we need. We'll also cover where we build the connectors at, how to build a connector from scratch using just the endpoint address, bringing in the Graph API actions we've already outlined, and then testing the connector once it's been created so that we can validate it before we move on to Power Automate. Now that the boring parts are pretty much done, let's get our hands dirty and build this connector. The first step in building our custom connector is to log into portal.office.com, find the Power Automate icon, and open it. Or you can directly navigate to flow.microsoft.com. Once logged in and presented with this screen, we'll click on the data dropdown on the left-hand side and then select Custom Connector. This will present us with a list of all our existing custom connectors, if there are any, and provide us the ability to create new connectors. By default, there are 5 options to select from when creating a new connector. The first, create from blank. The next, create from Azure Service. This is currently in preview. Import an Open API file, import an Open API file from a URL, or importing a Postman collection. Since we will primarily be focused on Teams automation tasks and the number of items that we're going to be created is limited, I'm going to choose to select Create from Blank. This will allow us the ability to start from just a Graph API endpoint and an action, excluding any unnecessary overhead the others might bring. Next, we're going to go ahead and name our custom connector. So for this one, we're going to go Marathon Graph API to keep things consistent. Once we have entered our name, we'll be presented with the first 4 tabs of the configuration for our custom connector, General Information. Within this tab, you can adjust the icon image associated with your connector, allowing you to customize and distinguish your connectors from each other. Enter a description for the connector and the purpose it serves, but most importantly, enter the host URL and select the scheme type, HTTP or HTTPS. Lucky for me, I've selected an icon from the marketing materials for the event, so you don't have to worry about seeing my artistic abilities. For the scheme, we're going to select HTTPS, and the host URL we're going to enter is graph.microsoft.com. One quick reminder for everyone, be sure not to include any HTTPS or HTTP. This has already been taken care of you by the scheme radio buttons above. Next, we'll click the security button to move on to the next tab. Step 2, security. We're going to select the authentication type for our connector. In our case, based on the prior work we did to configure the Azure App Registration, we're going to move forward with selecting OAuth. Once the OAuth type has been selected, we're going to move forward with changing the identity provider from General OAuth 2 to Azure Active Directory. This change will present us with a number of fields that we'll need to complete in order to define our custom connector in the next tab. For this, we'll refer back to the information we copied down while completing the app registration and enter the values accordingly, pulling in the client ID, client secret, and of course the tenant ID. The login URL will fill in by default to login.windows.net. And for the resource URL, we're going to use the https graph.microsoft.com. Scope can remain blank, and for the time being, we can click on the definition button to move forward. Once the connector is built, the redirect URL will be provided, and we can complete the necessary actions with that later. The third and final configuration tab for the custom connector is the definition tab. The definition page is where you'll input the specific API actions from the graph that we are trying to execute. To get started, click on the New Action button. With the page now open, we're going to input some information to describe the API. The summary field is used as the title of the action and is what will appear within Power Automate when we select to add the action. So we are going to enter clone a team and move down to the description fields. This field is used when you hover over the information icon to describe the action. For the description field, we're going to enter clone a team graph API action and provide the necessary details associated with it. For the operation ID, we're going to enter clone team, all one word. This field requires that no spaces are entered. Next, we're going to move down to the request section of the page and select import from sample. Upon clicking on this option, a panel will open from the right side of the screen. This form is where we will enter our API verb. This is a get where we're looking to retrieve data, or a delete where we're looking to remove something, or a post where we're looking to create. For us, we're going to use the post action and move down to the URL. Within the URL field, we're going to enter the following: https graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/teams/id/clone. I have replaced the bracketed ID value with Teams ID so that when this appears in Power Automate, it's specific to the value we're looking for. This is, of course, just my personal preference, but I like to label all bracketed items with a prefix or a suffix so that we can reduce the confusion later on for support down the road. Now that our URL and verbs are documented, we'll enter a sample of the body payload the system can expect. These are the values that were shown earlier in the review of the Graph API Clone a Team action. If you're unsure of any of the Graph API values, there are two great resources to check on. The first, obviously, the Microsoft documentation. I'm not a huge fan of most documentation, but the way that this is broken down is fantastic. It shows all the properties of the API calls, permissions required, and example scenarios that you can reference. The second, of course, is the Graph Explorer. If you're unsure, go get your hands dirty and take a look. Outside of pasting these default values in from the Graph documentation, there are no other modifications necessary at this time. We're all set to click the Import button, which will save the action we just built. Once the request has been completed, you will see all of the red asterisks and exclamation marks removed, and you can click the Create Connector or continue adding additional actions. We're going to go ahead and select the Create Connector and wait for the process to complete. With the connector now created, we're going to want to navigate back to the second tab, Security, and locate the redirect URL. We're going to copy this value and head over to Azure. Once within the Azure Portal, navigate to App Registrations and locate the App Registration Marathon Graph API. We are then going to find the redirect in the upper right-hand corner of the screen and select Add a Redirect. We'll select Add a Platform, choosing the web option once that's available, and next we'll paste the redirect value from the custom connector into the available text box. No other configuration for logout URL or implicit grant for access tokens or ID tokens is necessary at this time. Once the configure button has been selected, we have essentially linked our app registration with all of its API permissions, shared secret, and configuration to our custom connector within Power Automate to complete the Graph API clone a team action. Now it's time to make sure everything works, so let's go ahead and do that. In order to test the connector that we just built, we'll need to retrieve a valid team or group ID. This can be done a few different ways. The first is you can navigate to Microsoft Teams and use the Get Link to Team button, which you can then just parse for the group ID. This sounds more complicated than it is. Typically, it just takes a few seconds. The second is you can use the new connectors in Power Automate for Microsoft Teams to list the teams and review the values provided for them to gather the required team ID. And the third is to use the Graph Explorer's query to retrieve a list of teams that you can then parse and pull an ID from. With the ID value now in our possession, we'll head back to Power Automate Custom Connectors page. We'll paste in the value from the sample team ID we just retrieved into the team ID fields. Next, we will name our new team in the display name fields, provide a description for the team, and enter a male nickname. Under the parts to clone, we'll include all the values available to us to ensure everything is functioning normally. Later on, when we automate the process, we can pick and choose what we would like to include or exclude from the cloning process. And finally, under visibility, we have the option to make this a public team or a private team. For the purposes of what we're doing right now, I'm going to go ahead and enter public. The API response provided by the test we've run has returned a status value of 202, which means it has completed successfully. To ensure that this is accurate, I'm going to hop over into Microsoft Teams and validate the new team Marathon Test Connector was built. Now, before we run the final demo, let's take a look at this simple workflow that's driving our entire process to create a team just by someone approving it via an email button. The trigger is sparked whenever a new item is submitted to the associated SharePoint library. The next thing here is a compose action. Now, this is typically used for composing messages, taking inputs from various fields, and other purposes. But during an Ignite video in 2019, I came across a session where someone was providing a detailed outline of the flow that they did, along with version updates and history. Since versioning isn't something that's currently available, I've adopted this strategy as a way for myself to ensure stability and consistency in my builds. Now that the workflow has kicked off, I want to ensure status updates are reflected in my list. For the purposes of the user who submitted it, the administrators who will be managing this, and any manager or oversight for reporting purposes. Next, we'll use an out-of-the-box approval process, which will generate an email to a specific user or multiple users depending on your needs. Within this email, we'll provide the users with an approval or reject button along with the details required. Once the approver or administrator has provided a response to approve or reject the workflow, we'll move forward accordingly. If the outcome is denied, we'll update the SharePoint list item and then send an email back to the requester informing them of the decision. If the request is approved, we'll notify the user of the approval, update the SharePoint list item, and move forward to the Clone a Team connector. The Clone a Team actions that you now see in the flow underneath the condition if yes, if no, are based on the custom connector actions we built earlier in the session. Naming the team ID and associated values when building the connector ensured that when we added the action into Power Automate, things were labeled accordingly, providing a simple text field to complete. Based on the selection made by a user of an open or a restricted team, we'll determine which condition is met and outline the appropriate team to clone. Once the matching has been completed, an email will be sent notifying the original submitter of completion. With the understanding of our flow out of the way, let's demo this and wrap up our session. Within our SharePoint list, we're going to demo the creation of two different types of teams. The first team is a team with no permissions for members and no Giphy fun, while the second has a wide variety of open permission structures. We will name the first marathon restricted, provide a description for the team, make any adjustments to the parts that we feel necessary while we're cloning, change the visibility status to a private team, and select the restricted team in the dropdown. Now this team dropdown for template choice allows us to select what base team we'd like to clone. The status field is an automatic field that is updated by our flow based on the progress made. In our flow, we associated the dropdown choice with the team or group IDs for the template, so that the end users don't need to know or ask for that information, simplifying the entire process. The only thing we need to determine is if they want a restrictive team or a more free-flowing team. Once we have entered all the necessary information, we'll go ahead and click the Save button, which will trigger our workflow to start. Our administrator will then get an email to approve or deny the request. This email contains some basic information regarding the submission, and based on your needs, you can customize this to add as much detail as needed. Let's go ahead and approve this request. Upon approval being received, the SharePoint list status will update to approved, and the Graph API Clone a Team action will begin its process of creating the new team. Switching over to Microsoft Teams, we see that the new team, Marathon Restricted, has now been created, but first let's go to SharePoint Saturday, which is the baseline for our restrictive team. If we open up the Manage Team and review the settings, we see that all of the available options have been unchecked, and under Fun Stuff, every option has been removed. Now let's make sure our new team's configuration matches this by navigating to the Manage Team under the Marathon Restricted team. Great news. It's identical. The Clone a Team action configured the settings accordingly. All properties such as the name, description, and Fun Stuff match what we would have expected based on the clone's actions and our input. Moving on to our second example, we're going to navigate back to the SharePoint list and create a new entry for the Marathon Open team. Provide a description for that team, make any of the available adjustments to the parts to clone we feel necessary, change the visibility status to a public team, and select the Open Team dropdown. Again, this dropdown for template choice allows us to select the base team we would like to clone. The status field is an automatic field that is updated by our flow based on the progress made. Once we've entered all the necessary information, we'll go ahead and click the Save button, which will trigger the start of our workflow. If we go ahead and refresh the list, we'll see that the entry has been submitted and the status has been updated accordingly to pending approval. Once our administrator approves the request and we move forward with the approve email, we will refresh the page to see that the status has been updated to completed. And it's time to switch over to Microsoft Teams to now validate our Marathon Open team. Once we open the Manage option and navigate to Settings, we see all the available options are checked, which matches our open template, and we have all the fun stuff we can handle, unlike the restrictive template. So we've demoed the Graph API, Power Automate Workflow, a custom connector, and dynamically creating teams from a user submission within SharePoint. Let me show you one or two more things before I let you all go about your day. Here's an example of my custom connector that I'm using for Teams management. This connector has pretty much every available option from the Graph API related to Teams, but my favorites have been the messages and the addition of members or owners. These items were always such a pain to previously do. If you're talking about messages, you'd have to go to security and compliance and run report and do a couple extra steps that weren't really necessary. With the flow I've built, I've used my connector to enter the team name and the channel name to extract all the messages that I want, along with the replies, to a single file output. For the team member or team owner additions, I simply enter the team ID and the user ID associated to complete the task. You can take this a step further by adding it to a CDS connection, a SQL connection, or maybe Active Directory to trigger a workflow which dynamically adds or removes users and owners from the teams. Here's a couple integrations that I've just wrapped up or am finishing this week. A Raspberry Pi status indicator for my home office with the Graph API thanks to Elios, an Epic EHR custom connector, a Twitter connector, a Yext location services connector, and obviously the Microsoft Bookings custom connector. If you have any questions, like I mentioned before, please feel free to reach out. I'm always available. So as I wrap this up, I just want to say again, thank you to everyone that joined. Thank you to the people behind the scenes making this event function, and to the sponsors for making this a reality. I hope everybody stays safe, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.